In the oldest surviving copies of the Book of Enoch, there is a passage that describes a day when death is taken out of the world. It is not delayed and it is not defeated in some final battle. It is removed, the way you take down a wall that was never meant to be permanent. And the strangest part is what Enoch says happens to the people who are still standing when that wall comes down. He does not say they go to heaven. He does not say they rest. What he says is that they change. Their bodies become something the text can barely name, and the words it reaches for are the same words it uses for stars, for fire, and for the beings it calls the sons of light. This is one of the most detailed accounts of what a human being is meant to become that survives anywhere from the ancient world, and it was cut out of Scripture before most of the world ever read a single line of it. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of everything the Book of Enoch records about the end of death and what the human body becomes after it, the passage on the tree of life, the transformation into beings of light, the Council of Laodicea's own canon list, with Enoch struck from it in the year 364. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. To understand why this passage matters, you have to understand what the Book of Enoch actually is, and why so few people have ever read it. The book is old. The sections scholars call the Book of the Watchers were already being copied and studied more than 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the caves near Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch turned up among the fragments. That is more surviving copies than several books that made the final cut into the Hebrew Bible. People were not ignoring this text. They were reading it, copying it, and treating it as something close to authoritative. Then it disappeared from the Western canon. The Council of Laodicea, in the year 364, helped set the boundaries of what Christian communities were permitted to read as Scripture, and Enoch was left outside those boundaries. Over the centuries that followed, the book was preserved almost entirely in one place. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept it inside its canon and copied it in Ge'ez, an ancient liturgical language, generation after generation, in stone churches that Rome held no authority over. For most of European history, the complete text was simply gone. Scholars knew it had existed because early Christian writers had quoted from it, but the book itself had become a rumor. That changed in 1773, when the Scottish traveler James Bruce carried 3 complete Ge'ez manuscripts of Enoch out of Ethiopia and back to Europe. The first English translation followed in 1821, produced by Richard Lawrence. A more influential edition came from R.H. Charles in 1906, and it is Charles's wording that most people still quote today, usually without realizing how many quiet choices he made about how to render passages that had no clean equivalent in English. This is exactly where the story of what a human being becomes starts to get complicated. The passages describing the end of death are the same passages where those translation choices matter most. The clearest statement comes in a section describing a mountain and a tree. In the 25th chapter, an angel leads Enoch to a great mountain with a fragrant tree at its summit, and tells him plainly that no mortal is permitted to touch it until a fixed time of judgment. After that time, the tree is given to the righteous. Its fruit becomes their food, and the text describes what the fruit does to a person. It grants long life upon the earth, a length of days like the lives of the ancient fathers, and it removes sorrow, pain, plague, and torment from everyone who eats of it. The setting of that tree is worth picturing, because Enoch does not place it just anywhere. He describes a range of 7 mountains, and at the center of them, one mountain shaped like a throne, ringed by fragrant trees. The tree of life stands there, reserved and guarded, its scent carrying further than any earthly plant. The angel guiding him explains that this tree will not be touched by any mortal hand until the great judgment, when everything is finally set right. Only then is it released. The image is not of a reward waiting somewhere in the clouds. It is of a specific place, on a remade earth, holding a specific thing that has been kept back from humanity until the appointed hour. Read that slowly, because it is not describing a soul in a distant paradise. It is describing a physical change to living human beings on the surface of the earth. The tree is a source, the fruit is a mechanism. The result is a human body that no longer decays on the schedule every human body has always followed. An earlier passage in the 10th chapter says nearly the same thing in a different way. It describes a coming age in which the righteous will live until they have begotten children in the thousands, passing all the days of their youth and their old age in peace. The number sounds like poetry until you sit with what it actually claims. It claims a lifespan so long that one person could watch thousands of their own descendants be born. That is not a metaphor for a good life. It is a description of a species whose relationship with time has been rewritten. That same 10th chapter goes even further about the condition of the world once this begins. It describes the earth being cleansed of all corruption, all wrong, and all plague, so that the ground itself is healed alongside the people who live on it. The righteous who remain are said to sin no longer, to stop falling into the failures that defined the old world. It is a total reset, not only of the human body, but of the environment that body lives in. Death is pulled out at the root, and everything that grew from that root, the sickness, the decay, the slow ruin of every living thing, is pulled out along with it. Enoch is describing a world running on entirely different physics from the one we know. There is a quieter promise threaded through the earlier chapters as well. The elect, the text says, will inherit the earth, and light and grace will be given to them, and they will hold it and live out their days without the toil, the sickness, and the grief that shortened every life before them. Read casually, it sounds like ordinary religious comfort. Read closely, it is a claim that the entire human experience of decline, the arc that carries every person from strength into weakness and finally into the grave, is going to be switched off for a chosen group while they go on living. So, Enoch treats the end of death not as a single moment, but as a condition that settles over the world. Something is taken away, and once it is gone, the ordinary rules of the body stop applying. But the tree and the long life are only the first layer. The harder question is what happens to the people who already died long before any of this arrives. Enoch answers that too. And the answer is not the soft, cloudy afterlife most people picture. In the 51st chapter, the text describes the earth itself, giving back what has been placed inside it. The ground returns what was entrusted to it. The deep holding place of the dead, which the text treats as a kind of storage, releases what it has received. This is not the language of ghosts drifting upward. It is the language of a return, of something buried being brought back into the open and made whole again. The dead are not pictured as spirits alone. They are pictured as being reassembled and stood back up on their feet. That makes this one of the earliest and most concrete resurrection scenes in the whole of surviving religious literature, and it predates the versions most people are familiar with. Enoch is not saying the good part of you survives while the rest is discarded. He is saying the whole of you is recovered, restored, and then handed the same transformation the living receive. Death is undone in both directions at once. The living stop dying, and the dead are brought back to stand among them. So the living are changed and the dead are returned. The obvious next question is what, exactly, they are changed into. And here the text becomes almost impossible to read as ordinary metaphor. In the 62nd chapter, Enoch describes the righteous after the transformation, and he reaches for the language of clothing. He says they will be dressed in garments of glory. Then he uses a second phrase that is stranger and far more specific. He calls them garments of life. The ones who wear them will not grow old. Their appearance will not fade. The text says they will shine, that their faces will carry light, and that they will dwell with the sons of light in a state that no longer contains an ending. The phrase garments of life is the one worth stopping on. In the world Enoch came out of, clothing was the outer layer, the thing that covered and protected the body. To call the new state a garment of life is to say that life itself becomes the covering. The body is not merely healed. It is reclothed in something that does not decay, and the old covering, the flesh that ages and fails, is exchanged for a covering that cannot. Later sections push this further still. In the material near the very end of the book, Enoch describes the spirits of the righteous being turned into brightness, into a kind of fire and light, no longer heavy, no longer bound to the slow decline of a mortal frame. Elsewhere, the righteous are simply named the light, as if the distinction between a glorified human being and a source of light has stopped meaning anything. What a human becomes, in Enoch's account, is a luminous, deathless being that stands somewhere between the person they once were and the angels the text calls the watchers of heaven. Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the garments of glory is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original G's passage, the garments of life, the faces of light. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. There is a reason Enoch, of all people, is the one who recorded this, and it is not an accident of authorship. According to the tradition, the book comes out of Enoch did not die. The older scriptures that Western readers do know say only that he walked with God and then was not, because God took him. The Book of Enoch fills in what that taking actually looked like from the inside. In the 71st chapter, Enoch describes being lifted up, carried into the heavens, and brought before the throne. And in the course of that ascent, something happens to him. His own body is changed. He is not a visitor who looks on and then returns unaltered. He is remade in the presence of what he sees. And the text presents him as having crossed over into the very category of being he spends the rest of the book describing. Enoch becomes the first example of the thing he promises to everyone else. He is the demonstration case. The man who wrote down what humans become is, by his own account, the first human it happened to. That is why the account reads less like a vision and more like a report. Enoch is not guessing at a state he has never seen. He is describing a change he says he lived through, and then telling the reader that the same change is waiting on the far side of the day death is removed. The tradition that grew out of Enoch took this idea so seriously that later writers pushed it to its furthest edge. In texts composed centuries after the original, the transformed Enoch is no longer described merely as a glorified man. He is given a new name and a station near the very center of heaven, treated as the greatest of the transformed, the proof of how far a human being could be carried once death was no longer standing in the way. Those later texts are their own separate tradition and should be read as such. Even so, they grew straight out of a seed planted in the original, the simple and radical claim that a human being was never a finished thing, and that the form we live in now was only the first draft of what we were built to be. The single most direct description of what a person becomes sits near the end of the book, in a section addressed straight to the reader. Enoch tells the righteous that they will shine like the lights of heaven, that the gates of heaven will be open to them, and that they will become companions to the host of heaven. That last phrase is the one that should stop you cold. He is not saying the righteous will stand near the angels or admire them from a respectful distance. He is saying they will join them, take their place among them, and exist as the same kind of being. The line between a transformed human and an angel, in Enoch's account, does not merely blur, it is erased. It is easy to read past how strange the specifics really are. Enoch is not promising a slightly better version of the life people already have. He is promising a different kind of existence altogether, one where the body no longer wears down, where the face gives off light instead of merely reflecting it, where a person stands among the powers of heaven as an equal rather than a supplicant begging at the edge of the room. Every limit that defines a mortal life, the aging, the exhaustion, the fixed certainty of an end, is described as something that gets removed, rather than something that must be endured. The old covering comes off, the covering of life goes on, and the being left standing inside it is recognizably the same person, and at the very same moment something the ancient world had no ordinary word for. Another passage describes the elect walking in a light that never fades, under a sun that does not set, through days that have no number left to count. Time, in the old sense, is one of the casualties of the change. A mortal life can be measured because it runs out. Enoch describes a life that has stopped running out, and so the counting simply stops with it. The people in that state are not living longer the way a healthy person outlasts a sick one. They are living in a mode where the question of length no longer applies at all. One of the strangest sections of the book, an extended vision told entirely through the imagery of animals, closes on the same note from a different angle. At the end of its history, the vision describes the surviving righteous being transformed, every one of them changed into a new and radiant likeness, until they all come to resemble a single glorified form. Read through the symbolism. The meaning lands exactly where everything else in the book lands. Humanity is not merely rescued at the end. It is converted into something that did not exist before. A new kind of being that carries the old person inside it but is no longer bound by anything the old person was bound by. There is a symmetry in all of this that the ancient readers would not have missed. The story every one of them knew began with a tree and a loss. A man and a woman reached for fruit they had been told not to touch, and the price was death entering the world and the road back to the tree of life being sealed shut behind them. Enoch describes the exact reversal of that opening scene. The tree returns, the fruit is given rather than forbidden. The death that entered at the beginning is drawn back out again at the end. What was lost in the first garden is not merely restored in Enoch's account. It is handed over for good, to a version of humanity that has finally been changed enough to be trusted with it. Enoch is careful, though, to say that this transformation is neither automatic nor universal. The book draws a hard line between the ones who are remade and the ones who are not. The garments of life, the shining faces, the place among the host of heaven, all of it belongs to a specific group the text keeps calling the righteous and the elect. For everyone else, the book describes a very different outcome, and it spends a great deal of its length on the fate of the fallen watchers and those who followed their teaching down. The removal of death, in other words, is presented as the culmination of a long moral story rather than a mechanical upgrade handed to everyone alike. What a human becomes depends, in Enoch's telling, on which side of that line the person ends up standing. Now hold all of that next to what happened to the text in translation, because the gap is not small. When these passages moved from Ge'ez into English, the concrete kept softening into the abstract. A garment of life became, in many renderings, a vague spiritual reward. A body remade into light became a soul at peace. A lifespan measured in thousands of descendants became a general promise of blessing. Each single choice can be defended on its own. Taken together, they quietly convert a text about the physical transformation of the human body into a text about a comfortable, disembodied heaven. The framework the Western Church eventually settled on was clean and abstract. The good soul leaves the failing body behind and travels somewhere else. Enoch describes almost the reverse of that. The body is not left behind. It is kept, recovered if it was lost, and then upgraded into a form that does not break. The place of the transformation is not elsewhere. It is here, on a renewed earth, beneath a tree whose fruit ends decay. One framework treats the body as the problem to escape. Enoch treats the body as the very thing being saved. You can see why a book making that second claim, in that much detail, with named beings and measured lifespans and a described mechanism, was easier to leave outside the canon than to sit down and explain. Abstract promises can never be checked against anything. Enoch's promises read like specifications. It is worth asking why the concrete version was the one left behind. A promise of a peaceful soul in a distant heaven asks nothing of the world as it actually is. It cannot be tested, it cannot be dated, and it cannot embarrass anyone. Enoch's version is different in kind. It names a mechanism, a fruit from a specific guarded tree. It names a place, a renewed earth, rather than a far-off sky. And it names an outcome, a physical body remade into light with a span of years measured in thousands. A claim carrying that much structure invites exactly the sort of scrutiny that abstract comfort is designed to avoid, and a book full of claims like that is a far harder thing to keep inside an official canon than to quietly set outside of it. None of this stayed sealed inside one obscure book, either. The short letter of Jude, which did make it into the New Testament, quotes Enoch by name and treats him as a genuine prophet. Early Christian writers referred to the book, argued over it, and in more than a few cases plainly believed it. For a long stretch of time, the ideas inside it, including its picture of the transformed and deathless righteous, were part of the living conversation of the faith. The move to push the book out to the margins came later, and it was a decision, not an oversight. The picture of what a human becomes did not vanish because it was forgotten. It faded because it was set aside on purpose. None of this proves anything about the physical world, and it is worth being honest about that. Enoch is an ancient religious text, not a laboratory result, and the people who shaped it were working inside a symbolic and theological world rather than a scientific one. When the text says death will be removed and the body reclothed in a covering that does not decay, it is making a claim of faith about the end of history, and it deserves to be read first as exactly that. Still, it is hard to miss how the questions Enoch was asking have come back in our own time wearing a completely different vocabulary. We now talk openly about aging as a process that might be slowed or even halted. We talk about repairing the body at the level of the cell, about extending the human lifespan far past anything our ancestors imagined, about a future in which the biological clock everyone assumed was fixed turns out to be something that can be adjusted. Enoch framed the end of death as a gift handed down from above. The modern version frames it as an engineering problem. Yet both are circling the same unlikely idea that the death rate every human being has ever lived under might not be a permanent feature of what it means to be human. Whether that idea arrives as fruit from a mountain tree or as something built in a laboratory, Enoch reached the question first, and he was strikingly specific about what the answer would cost and what it would produce. It would cost the old body. It would produce a being of light that does not end. And the scrutiny, when it finally arrived, came from a direction no one in the ancient world could have predicted. For nearly all of human history, death was treated as the one fixed fact, the boundary that gave every other fact its weight. In the last century, that assumption began, very slowly, to crack. Researchers started treating aging not as destiny but as a biological process with distinct steps, and a process with steps is a process that might one day be interrupted. Work on the machinery of the cell, on the way tissue repairs and renews itself, on why the body eventually loses the ability to rebuild what it once rebuilt with ease, has quietly turned the oldest certainty humanity ever had into an open question. No one has removed death. It is only honest to say the goal remains distant and may never be reached at all. But the plain fact that serious people now study the removal of death as a problem to be solved, rather than a wall to be accepted, would have sounded to almost every generation before ours exactly like a page out of the Book of Enoch. So the Book of Enoch does not describe the removal of death as an ending. It describes it as a doorway, and it describes in unusual detail what walks through to the other side. A human being, whose years are counted in the thousands. A body reclothed in a covering of life in place of a covering of flesh. A face that carries its own light. A person who has crossed, quietly, into the category the text once kept only for angels and for stars. And the man who wrote it down claims he was the first to make that crossing, which is either the strangest coincidence in the history of religious literature or precisely the kind of testimony you would expect from someone who had genuinely seen the thing he was promising. The book was removed from Scripture more than 16 centuries ago. The tree, the garments of life, the returned dead, and the shining faces all stayed exactly where Enoch left them, waiting inside a text most of the world was never meant to read. And the claim at the center of it has not moved in all that time. That claim has outlived every council that voted against it and every empire that tried to bury the book carrying it, and it is still sitting there today, in plain Ge'ez, inside a text anyone can finally open and read for themselves, saying the same quiet and impossible thing it has been repeating for more than 2,000 years. Death was never built to be permanent, and what a human being becomes on the far side of it is the one thing the whole of the ancient world tried the hardest to forget.